An apartment fire in Xinjiang sparked mass protest all across China. Some are directly blaming the Chinese Communist Party. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Before we start off this episode, I want to let you know that YouTube is suppressing coverage of protests in China, even weeks after the fact. Our recent episode on the protests at Foxconn was age restricted, essentially killing the number of views. YouTube said it was because we showed some non-graphic footage of police beating an unarmed protester. And they wouldn't remove the age restriction unless we deleted or blurred out the footage. So, showing American police violence is okay, but showing Chinese police violence is not? Shame on YouTube for helping the Chinese regime censor what's really happening there. This is just like that time in 1989 in Tiananmen Square where absolutely nothing happened. I don't even know why I brought it up. This episode might be age restricted as well, especially with all the protest footage that we're about to show you, which is why we need supporters like you. The best thing you can do is to share this video, since YouTube won't, and directly support our show with $1 or more per episode over at patreon.com/China Uncensored. And if this video does get censored, you can still watch it without age restriction on Rumble or on Odyssey. So, the latest nationwide protests were sparked by an apartment fire in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang. That's where the mostly Muslim Uyghur minority live. The apartment fire killed at least 10 people, including 3 children. But those are the official numbers. The death toll is very likely much higher, according to people who lost relatives in the fire. According to one Uyghur rights organization, 44 Uyghurs died in the fire. Sure, fires happen, but in this case, it was made a lot worse because of China's zero COVID policy.
State media claims that people in the compound were allowed to leave the building. However, videos show fire trucks unable to get close to the scene because the compound entrance was partially blocked. The video shows it's blocked with fences, tents, and metal barriers that are normally used as part of COVID measures.
Because who cares about a fire hazard? It's not like fires ever hurt anybody, but COVID spreading in a time when there are widespread vaccines and treatments? That would be a tragedy. Outrage started to build over the apartment fire on the Chinese internet, especially as unconfirmed video started spreading of people supposedly caught in the fire screaming for help. It also didn't help that the head of Urumqi's fire department responded to criticism by saying some residents' ability to rescue themselves was too weak and they failed to escape in time. That's your job. That'd be like a cop saying their ability to not get mugged was too weak, and they failed to not get mugged in time. I know, I watched the whole thing happen from over here. Chinese citizens across the country have faced zero COVID policies for a long time. There's been outrage in the past, like back in September, after a bus carrying people to forced quarantine crashed, and the arrest of the bridge man in October, the guy who hung a banner in Beijing protesting zero COVID in Xi Jinping. There are also a lot of protests that don't get covered in the media. If you want to know more about that, check out our interview with Kevin Slayton from the NGO Freedom House. The link is below. Assuming this video isn't being censored, I might be speaking into an endless void right now. There's no way I can know. No. Thanks, YouTube. But the point is, the fire in Urumqi and the way zero COVID made it so much worse sparked large-scale protests all across China. The people protesting in Urumqi, by the way, were mostly Han Chinese people, not the ethnic Uyghur people who've traditionally lived in the region for centuries. If you're wondering why Uyghurs aren't protesting, it's because they're here. Some, anyway. A lot of them are also here. I'm just kidding. The CCP requires cremation now. But even the Uyghurs who aren't locked up have a much harder time protesting than ethnically Han people. That's the main Chinese ethnic group. But despite ethnic tensions, the Urumqi fire brought out solidarity across China, because people realize that ethnicity doesn't matter when you're locked in an apartment unable to escape a fire because of the CCP zero COVID policy. It could have happened to anyone in China. Wow, who could have guessed that a corrupt regime actively engaging in genocide wouldn't prioritize public safety? What's next? You're going to tell me that Ted Bundy wasn't a big fan of feminist literature? Over in Shanghai, protesters gathered on Saturday night in Urumqi Road, a street named after Urumqi. They held up blank white pieces of paper in remembrance of the apartment fire victims. Those blank papers refer to China's rampant censoring that erases words from Chinese social media, which is a powerful sentiment when you know the context. Without it, this looks like the least creative art class of all time. Then they started chanting, "Lift the Xinjiang lockdown, lift the Xinjiang lockdown." Here you can see them shouting, "We want freedom." There were a lot of FUs directed at the COVID QR codes that control people's access to different places. And there were attacks directly at the Chinese Communist Party itself. These people are saying, "CCP, step down." Man, it's great to see these citizens standing up for themselves and fighting back. Of course, I say it's great to see, assuming anyone sees it. Chinese leader Xi Jinping was criticized as well. Here's another clip of protesters saying, "CCP step down, Xi Jinping step down." One witness recounted how police reportedly told people to go home and watch the World Cup. But given that the rest of the world is having a blast without COVID restrictions, that's probably making Chinese people even angrier. There were even protests in the Chinese capital of Beijing on Sunday night, which is very rare. People sang to mourn the Xinjiang fire victims. After police told them to stop chanting "no more lockdowns," people got creative and chanted "more lockdowns. I want to do COVID tests." Well played, people. Well played. Others marched while singing the Internationale, the socialist anthem associated with the Communist Party. Yes, it's a communist song, but it's also about rising up against your oppressors. That's brilliant trolling. That's like throwing eggs at Miley Cyrus while singing "Party in the USA." What do you mean this is rude? I'm clearly a big fan. Right now, I hope at least one member of the CCP is thinking, are we the baddies? Here at the Beijing Capitol Club, a 5-star mansion, people shout, "We don't want lies, we want dignity." And in another part of Beijing, people were calling for freedom and human rights, and to tear down the Great Firewall, China's internet censorship system. Although I wouldn't hold my breath. Asking the Chinese Communist Party for freedom is like asking for caviar at Del Taco. But what you should understand is that these protests are a big deal, especially because students are playing a crucial role. More after the break. Welcome back. This isn't the first time Chinese people have protested the zero COVID policy. We've been showing you these protests all along. But the fire in Urumqi sparked something big, including among students, which are considered the most dangerous group in China. Remember the last time there were student protests? It was a serious crime, and not just against fashion. There were also simultaneous protests across China, which hasn't really happened since 1989. Here you can see students this past weekend at Tsinghua University holding up papers in protest. Tsinghua is like the MIT of China. Students chanted freedom of expression, democracy, rule of law. Some of those papers had the Friedman equation, a play on the English words free man. So, nerds with courage. Students also protested in Xi'an and Nanjing. The principal of Nanjing University came out to tell them, "You'll pay for this." Yeah, they already know that. College is all about having to pay through the nose. Aside from mass public gatherings, students have been protesting by posting messages on walls. This one, for example, is at the Central Academy of Drama in Beijing. It says, "Give me liberty or give me death," a reference to the American revolutionary Patrick Henry. The same message was painted onto a wall at Shanghai Theater Academy. These protesters are such drama queens, especially since it's obvious that the CCP would respond, "Liberty or death?" Death, obviously. I mentioned in an earlier episode how protesters have also been scrawling messages in bathrooms because there's no surveillance inside. Here's one in the men's bathroom at Beijing Institute of Fashion Technology with the message, "People, rule by law, freedom," which is a way more poignant message than the last thing I saw scrawled on a bathroom wall. And yes, that's my home bathroom. My roommate Carl is the worst. Protesters across the country demanded that lockdowns be lifted, like here in Guangzhou. In Wuhan, where the COVID pandemic started, people dismantled barricades. Here in Lanzhou, you can see people overturning a COVID testing booth. Even residents in Urumqi, where the apartment fire took place, pushed through barricades and sang the national anthem in protest. Although at this point I don't know if it's a protest or fire safety. Who's too weak to rescue themselves now, you lazy fire chief? Chinese authorities, of course, are clamping down. Many protesters were taken away by the police, some by cops in plain clothes. Not even foreign journalists are safe. Here you can see BBC journalist Edward Lawrence being arrested during the protests in Shanghai as people yell for the police to release him. The Urumqi road sign was also removed, presumably because the CCP doesn't realize people have maps on their phones. If we remove the road sign, then no one will know where to protest. This plan is foolproof. And people are being arrested seemingly at random, even after the protests. And in the days after the protests in Beijing and Shanghai, police vans filled the streets instead. All this is grabbing the attention of people around the world. Protesters in front of the Chinese embassy in London also called for Xi Jinping to step down. There were also protests in Canada, the US, and Australia. Even some brave souls in Hong Kong. Some are optimistic about the protests in China, saying that they're the start of an unstoppable revolution. Of course, the Chinese regime is trying to cover it up. On Twitter, tons of Chinese bots suddenly started spamming searches for the Chinese names of cities where there were protests. Instead of protest videos, you just found ads featuring attractive Chinese girls, as well as other nonsense ads. That's as devious as it is brilliant. This would be like if a teenage boy asked why his father missed his baseball game and the dad threw a pile of Playboys at him. I'm still mad, but I'm suddenly distracted for some reason. But will these protests be the big one that takes down the Chinese Communist Party? Probably not. The Communist Party continues to have firm control over the police, military, elites, and institutions like the media and education system. Plus, they have ads with pretty goyles. They're nearly unstoppable. It also certainly doesn't help that foreign businesses like Apple continue to bow to the CCP. But that doesn't mean the protests don't mean something. It's exposing the rot inside the Chinese Communist Party to both Chinese people and the rest of the world. And it could be one of many sparks that eventually do ignite real, lasting change. Assuming companies like YouTube stop bowing down to the CCP and let people see it. And now, as a thank you to all my wonderful fans who support China Uncensored through the crowdfunding website Patreon or our exclusive social media platform Locals, I'll answer one of your questions. Today's question comes from Ipurik on Locals. I was thinking if a lot of people will succeed to flee out of China now and arrive to the Western world applying for asylum, how will the governments in those countries react? Is the danger of having potential spies increasing? Will the Western governments be able to give those people protection knowing how long the CCP's hand can grip? Good question, Ipurik. For many years before COVID, there were people fleeing China to seek asylum in other countries. People like Uyghurs, Falun Gong practitioners, Tibetans, and so on. But inevitably, some of the people fleeing China have been spies. 2 years ago, the Trump administration tightened visa rules specifically for Chinese Communist Party members, reducing the length of certain travel visas. But that didn't affect immigration. And anyway, it's not that easy to determine who is a party member, since there's no public membership roster. And if asked about it, a party member might just lie. Imagine that. Western countries could just ban all asylum seekers from China, but that would mostly hurt the people asylum laws are designed to protect. So there's no simple way to both protect refugees and stop spies. Of course, there may be fewer asylum seekers now anyway. Not because everyone loves being in China, but because China stopped issuing new passports for most people and put exit curbs in place, so it's harder and harder to leave. Somehow, though, I don't think they'll stop their own spies from getting passports and going abroad. Thanks for your question, and thank you for supporting us on Locals. If you're not a supporter already, join us on Locals. For a small monthly contribution, you can chat directly with me, Matt, and Shelley, and with other China Uncensored fans in our own social media space. You'll also get other cool perks, including the ability to ask me a question I can answer on the show. The link is below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.